This question is for both candidates. When do peaceful protests under our First Amendment become unlawful, dangerous, and violent? And when would you put a stop to this, making sure that we do go back to peaceful protests and not allowing our city to burn night after night? Thank you.
Ms. Iannarone, you're up first, and you have 60 seconds.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Christensen. I know how upsetting it is when there is unrest in your neighborhoods, especially when night after night we're seeing that protests about police brutality are met with increased police brutality, and how comfortable it can be when things like tear gas are administered and leak into the homes of residents in neighborhoods across the city. The answer to addressing the issue that's happening in our streets is to standing alongside these young Black Lives Matter leaders, meeting with them, talking with them, working with them on these issues, and making progress toward real reform. I condemn violence in all forms, I always have, but we must know that the answer to protests about police brutality cannot be increased police brutality.
I'll give you just a few more seconds, Ms. Iannarone, because I think he also wanted to know, where do you draw the line between peaceful protests and when they become into criminal activity?
We need equal enforcement of the law regardless of who is engaging in criminal activity. And as Portland mayor, I will not be able to control what any individual protester is doing in the streets. My job will be making sure that the police do their jobs, making sure that they're held accountable for when they break procedure and even the law. That will be my job as Portland mayor, and ultimately we'll have a police force that's well equipped to enforce the law without racial bias in the future.
I have a follow-up for you. You've been called the Antifa mayor. Are you Antifa? And how would that guide how you would handle protests as mayor?
I love that Joe Biden answered this question before me, because being opposed to fascism in 2020 is not something to be embarrassed about. I have a bumper sticker from the beginning of my campaign that says #everydayAntifascist. And what I have tried to do is normalize peaceful responses to the rise of white nationalism by organizing in my community. I organized this summer when the Proud Boys came to town, I organized a menstrual product drive for my neighbors residing in the Laurelwood shelter, because the answer to toxic masculinity is an inclusive, pluralist society where people of all backgrounds feel welcome.
Let me jump in here and just ask you, though, is being anti-fascist the same thing as being Antifa? Are you Antifa?
Antifa is not anything more than an idea. That's what Vice President Biden explained to us. It's people who oppose anti-fascism. And I strongly oppose anti-fascism, and I adopt and implement peaceful responses to that. And that is how I describe my position on this issue. Donald Trump has decided to make the enemy of groups of people who oppose his bullies and his militia forces. But I'm not going to be caught up in that rhetoric, because it's false. It creates division in our society. It creates division in our city, when what we need is every single Portlander faced in the right direction, saying hate is not welcome here.
Thank you. Mayor Wheeler, I'm going to read Mr. Christensen's question again for you. When do peaceful protests under our First Amendment become unlawful, dangerous, and violent? And when would you put a stop to this, making sure we go back to peaceful protests, not allowing our city to burn night after night?
All right, well, let's start with the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is our nation and our community are going through a national reckoning around racial justice and equity, and there's calls for common sense police reforms. And tens of thousands of Portlanders have taken to the streets, joining millions of people around the country, and we should support this. This is an important movement, it's an important time, and I certainly embrace it. On the other hand, there are people who've been engaged in nightly violence and criminal destruction. And leaders should say unequivocally that violence will not be condoned. And for those who are engaged in active violence or criminal destruction, regardless of their political beliefs, they should be held accountable for that violence and criminal destruction, period. And when it comes to police reform, of course, I support police reform. And that's One of the reasons that my colleagues and I on the City Council are referring an overhaul of our accountability and oversight mechanism to the November ballot. I support it. I want you to support it because it'll help us hold cops accountable when they do things wrong.
I do have a follow-up for you, Mayor Wheeler. You've been called weak for your handling of the protests, while others have called you tear gas Ted. What's going to be different? How will things change if you're reelected?
Well, look, I get it from both sides. People saying the police are overbearing, people saying the police aren't engaging enough. And the bottom line here is you've got to draw the line carefully, because on one hand, we are going to support nonviolent and peaceful demonstration. We're going to support the First Amendment rights of people to gather and express their opinions, particularly during this time where people are really speaking out loudly for social justice and racial equity. But on the other hand, we have to do what we need to do for the police to be able to hold people accountable. That includes working with the district attorney, as we have, to hold those who are engaged in egregious acts of violence or vandalism accountable. It means we need to encourage the courts to work with us to not put into place restrictions that would impede our ability to hold people
Mayor.
accountable. And it's about building.
Thank you.